Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. Find them at artistfirst.com. And now, your host, live from England, here she is. It's Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. This is Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it is my absolute pleasure to be speaking with the amazing Justin Brierley, host of the podcast The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which features interviews with secular and Christian thinkers. This series accompanies Justin's book of the same title. Justin, what an honour to be speaking with you today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks, Deborah. Lovely to be talking to a fellow Brit.
Oh, yes!
Yeah, looking forward to our conversation.
It's a novelty for me as well, because they tend to be in the US, so it's quite nice that there's no time difference.
Absolutely, yes. Well, yeah, thank you. And I'm so pleased that we're able to talk about this new book and podcast that I've recently released. So thanks for inviting me on.
Yes. Oh, thank you. No, the pleasure's on. I'm very excited about this because I've listened to many of your. I'm a YouTube addict, so I listen to many of your shows, and Can I just say at this point, I'm very touched and impressed that you're always so kind and non-judgmental, and you listen. And I think in the Christian world that goes far with when we're talking to skeptics, atheists, because I think sometimes we can so easily put their backs up, and no wonder they get angry with us. But you're always so loving.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I guess I've always tried to embody a sort of empathetic point of view, and I appreciate, whenever I've hosted conversations between Christians and non-Christians, I've really appreciated that the non-Christians want to come on and give their time, and so I think it's only, my duty to give them the respect they're due and to listen to their arguments as sympathetically as possible. And certainly, as a Christian, I believe obviously that we're called to treat everyone, whether they share our faith or not, with love and kindness. Yeah. Sadly, unfortunately, in our culture, that doesn't always get, isn't always the case. But I'm glad that you felt that I was able to do that on my show. Yeah,
thank you so much for that, because I'm sort of what you would call a lukewarm mustard seed Christian, and I think for someone that wants to sort of maybe grow in their faith, it's so important to have people like you, where it makes Christ appealing, and because sometimes we have a big enough struggle with belief to have Christians on top of that saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, you're in rebellion," or but you're so loving. Thank you. You're wonderful.
Oh, that's very kind, Deborah. Thank you. I'm very touched that you'd say that.
Oh, so you've been. Is it true you've been debating Christians, atheists and agnostics for nearly 2 decades?
Yeah, well, nearly.
Crumbs.
I got into broadcasting really about 20 years ago. And I worked for over 20 years for an organisation called Premier Christian Radio here in the UK. I haven't been hosting the conversations between Christians and atheists and agnostics for that entire time, but it's still a long time, over 17 years.
Wow.
that I hosted the Unbelievable show. I did move on from that actually just in Easter this last year, but it was an amazing, privilege to host so many conversations. And in a way, I wasn't the one doing the debating. I was kind of leaving that usually to the guests, to the people who came in and represented the Christian point of view or the atheist point of view. And I just got the privilege of hosting it and moderating these fantastic discussions over all those years. And it's been a real kind of learning journey for me as I've been able to do that.
Yeah, that's great. That's an awful long time. It's about time you had a cup of tea, dear.
Absolutely, yeah. You do get thirsty after doing however many hundred of those conversations over the years.
Oh my goodness! So what initially? So I take it. Let's talk a bit about your book. So is your book is it dealing with people coming? Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong. Sort of people sort of having a certain standpoint and then thinking, hang on a minute, this thing over here makes a bit more sense now.
Yeah, I mean, I've published two books now, and the first one was at about the 10-year mark of hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists on this show called Unbelievable. And it was really my attempt to sketch out why I think it can make good sense to be a Christian. From an intellectual point of view, I was trying to make a sort of an intellectual case for Christianity, drawing on lots of the conversations that I'd hosted on the show up to that point. And it wasn't that there weren't good objections to God. You know, there's still lots of big questions that exist. But I'd found over the course of hosting these conversations that actually, there's a good intellectual case for Christianity, for why God exists, for why you can trust what the Bible says about Jesus, and so on. And so that was really the aim of the first book, was to show that even in a very skeptical age that we live in, actually there are good reasons for being a Christian. Yeah. And to invite people who perhaps don't share the Christian faith to consider those arguments. The new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is more kind of looking at our culture now, which is, as I said, a very skeptical culture. Yes. But the fact that I'm seeing a change in the way people are thinking about faith. So my show, this Unbelievable show, began in the sort of mid-2000s, and around the time when a very dogmatic, anti-religious form of atheism was on the rise, New Atheism, it was often called. And this was, led by characters like Richard Dawkins, a well-known biologist and atheist who wrote this best-selling book, The God Delusion. And very much figures like him dismissed Christianity or religion in general as untrue and also bad for you, and would quite often ridicule it even, because they thought it was such a threat, if you like. But what I noticed in the last several years is the conversation changing quite a lot. And I saw that movement, New Atheism, really wane, actually. A lot of people, in fact, turning against it in many ways. Oh. And in the end, I've noticed a real trend in even secular thinkers starting to take faith much more seriously again, starting to ask whether we can even live without something like the Christian story to make sense of life. So that's really what the new book's about. It's kind of talking about the fact that I think we're at the beginnings of a surprising rebirth of belief in God, even in a culture where church-going is on decline, where less and less people describe themselves as Christian in the surveys and so on. I think we might just yet be seeing a kind of a new awakening awareness of God, and so that's what I'm exploring in the new book.
Oh, that's wonderful! I'm looking forward to purchasing my copy. It's sounds interesting, really. Do you know? I watched your interview with you've done a couple, haven't you, with Dawkins?
Yes, I have. So the most recent one I did was in 2022.
Oh, recent, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a really fascinating interchange between Richard Dawkins and Francis Collins.
Oh yes, yes, I've seen that recently. Yes.
Yeah, and Francis Collins is a very interesting person. He's a Christian. He's a geneticist. He headed up the team that decoded the human genome. He then sort of led the US response to COVID, and he was the head of the Institute for Health in the USA. Continues to be the president's sort of advisor on those kinds of issues. So a very, renowned geneticist and biologist himself, but a very committed Christian. And so it was great to have Francis Collins on opposite, equally a very renowned scientist like Richard Dawkins, but obviously Dawkins coming from a very atheistic point of view. Yeah. And what was interesting about their conversation was that, frankly, it was always difficult for me to ever get Richard Dawkins to come on, because in a way I think he often thought, well, look, is it worth my time debating Christians and so on? But actually I think he was willing to come on with Francis Collins because he saw him as an intellectual peer, someone who he really respected as a scientist. Okay. So was willing to come on to do that discussion on God and faith and science with him, because he really respected him as a fellow intellectual,
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Richard Dawkins, he fascinates me because in some respects he can be kinder than, I don't really want to name drop, but there are some sort of staunch atheists that are actually really quite unkind, but Dawkins can be more polite than those who perhaps aren't.
Yeah, I think he's mellowed, in all honesty.
Oh, okay.
In recent years, because I think there was a period when, he was pretty dogmatic, actually, in his denouncement of religion. And But I think it's interesting to see the way he has mellowed out a bit. And I think maybe even the kind of conversation I did with Francis Collins he wouldn't have done several years ago. I think one of the reasons for that, Deborah, is quite interesting, is that I think he's come to realise that even in his own camp, the atheist camp, there's a lot of division and dissension. And he's sometimes been at the sharp end of that the last few years. And one of the things I sketch out in this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is the way that the new atheist movement itself, which in some ways he was, the honorary head of, it kind of fell apart. It kind of unraveled because once people had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, they really couldn't agree on much else thereafter. And they started to have big fallout over where this movement should go, whether it should stand for a kind of various forms of social justice around feminism and LGBT rights, or whether it should just be about reason and free thinking. And in many ways, Dawkins himself came under a lot of criticism from some people in the movement because they felt that he was too much of a what's the word? Well, there was just I think there was just a bit of a movement against sort of old white men, essentially representing the movement, and it was considered there was time for a change.
Yeah,
and some of his views, started to become quite unfashionable in those circles. So, for instance, he has sort of critiqued some of the transgender ideology that's now very common, and for that he got stripped of his Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association.
Okay,
the people that he once would have considered his friends and allies suddenly were cancelling him from their campuses or were stripping him of awards.
Oh.
And I think that kind of made him realise, this is more complicated than I thought. And in a funny way, I think that's what's mellowed him out in terms of talking to Christians. Is he's realised, I can get in more trouble with my atheist friends and colleagues than I can with Christians. And in some ways, he was glad to have the conversation with Francis Collins, because at least they could agree on the science, on the truth of these things.
Yes.
Whereas he often found himself getting into hot water over these kind of sociological issues, with his fellow secularists. So, so it's been an interesting journey to see the way the ground has shifted in that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, Richard Dawkins has made a couple of very interesting comments in saying, he said at one point, sorry, these aren't his exact words, but worse the effect of prior to Darwin, theists could be forgiven for their views. And then he's also said, with regard to the origin of the universe, we're still awaiting our Darwin. So I'm thinking, why does he still believe that atheists should be mocked then?
Well,
Just I think,
so those
sorry, theists, not atheists.
They're examples of Dawkins, sort of view that essentially science has replaced the need for God.
Yeah.
And that's a view that he popularised through the new atheism. It's a view that many still share today, obviously. And to some extent, the problem is that Dawkins tends to see God as just a bad sort of scientific theory, basically. Yeah. And the problem is, of course, that actually science and theology, or science and God, they're very different things. Okay, science is good for showing us some things, like, the nature of matter and, how chemical reactions happen and that kind of thing. But they don't show you necessarily why the universe is here. They don't sort of give you a sense of meaning or value or purpose in life.
Yeah.
And often it's those things that God is a good explanation for, why we, the fact that we're here having this conversation, is that just about, pure chance and the fact that a cosmos happened to produce you and me? I don't think so. I think actually there's something about this universe and about you and me and the fact that we're having this conversation that says there's more to life, that there is some kind of purpose and design behind it. Dawkins, I think, thinks that because Darwin came along and showed a kind of a way in which you could show an evolution of life over time, that somehow explains away the need for a designer. But I don't think it does.
No.
I think it's just that there's a way you can see how, different forms of organisms would have arisen over a long period of time. But that doesn't explain why we care, why we have this idea that all humans have value. It doesn't explain where consciousness came from. It doesn't explain all kind of manner of things. But I think, and so I think Dawkins is sort of had this hope that science, that the more people knew about science, the less they'd think they needed God. But I think the opposite is true. I think that the more we know about science, as great as science is, the more we realise it can't solve all our problems. That actually, science alone can't make us more compassionate. It can't sort of buy us the meaning that people so desperately crave in life. It's good at showing the how, the sort of the can give you scientific explanations, but it doesn't show you the why. It doesn't show you why you're here and what the purpose of your life is. So I think that's the big thing for me with Dawkins is he wanted to give a kind of a scientific explanation for everything, but there are just some things science isn't meant to do, and where God is a much better explanation in some instances.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like, how would science... I mean, I'm far from... I didn't do well at science at school, any of it. But, how would science ever be able to touch the supernatural? I mean, surely there's things that science just can't detect, isn't there?
That's right. I mean, I think that in the end, science is great at doing some things. It's great as a toolkit for discovering, about the physical facts of the universe and that kind of thing. Yeah. And in that sense, I believe science is a gift from God. I don't think, people of faith should in any way be anti-science. I think it's a wonderful thing. But it's not, it doesn't show you everything. There are lots of things that we take for granted in life, which science really doesn't have anything to say about. If you love your partner, well, what's the scientific explanation for that? I mean, if you just looked at the chemicals and pheromones in your brain that happen when you feel love, that's not going to actually tell you what love is. That's just going to show you a set of physical, things, chemical reactions. The love itself is different. You can't explain that with science. It's a different nature of things. So obviously there are some things science is not there to tell us about. Like science can build you an atomic bomb, but it won't tell you how you should use that knowledge. So I think it just is a fact that there are lots of things in life where science is limited, and you can't use it to explain things, to make sense of things. And that's why, obviously, we do need God. I believe God is a kind of a better explanation of many aspects of human life.
Yeah.
And not a competing explanation to science. I think, in a way, again, in the new book, I talk about the fact that science itself is a highly Christian activity. It was Christians who birthed the scientific revolution. It was people who believed that there was an order in nature to be explored because there was a divine mind behind it that really got the scientific revolution going. Yeah. So for me, there's no contradiction between science and faith. It's just we need to put these different things in their proper place and understand that there are different ways of understanding the universe.
Yeah. That's true. And is it true that science can't really make a comment on the nature of consciousness?
Well, it's an interesting one because you've obviously got some philosophers who think that basically you can get ultimately a kind of physical, scientific explanation for consciousness. But I happen to think they're misguided. I mean, I don't claim to be a great expert on consciousness, but there's plenty of well-known experts on consciousness who think those who take this so-called physicalist approach to consciousness are misguided as well. Because what is consciousness? Well, it's this idea. It's the sense you have. It's seeing, smelling, thinking. It's perception. And the problem is that if you're saying, well, that is a purely physical process, then what you've got to ask is, well, show me how. And all that a scientist can do is show certain things happening in your brain when you smell something or think something or experience something.
Yeah. But
that physical thing, those chemicals moving around, those electrochemical sort of signals in your brain, they're not the thing, are they? That's not, when you smell coffee and you have that experience of smelling coffee, well, that's not the same thing as electrons moving around in your brain. There's something different about consciousness, about conscious experience that refuses to simply be put into a physical box. And this is what's sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness in the research. And I don't think you are ever going to get a purely physical explanation for that. It by its nature, it needs something different. It's a different realm of experience. So I think you run up against this problem just in everyday life, that science alone cannot give you a full explanation of everything. Consciousness is a different beast altogether.
Yeah, it seems to be, doesn't it? It
does seem to me that. And for me, God is a better explanation in a sense for why there is such a thing as consciousness. Like, purely material universe doesn't seem to give us an explanation for consciousness.
No.
Consciousness itself seems to be something rather different. It certainly somehow often interacts with and is dependent on the physical universe. You know, we need a brain to have that sense of consciousness, but it's not the same thing as being conscious. So I think there's all kinds of areas where there's a really interesting overlap with something beyond the physical universe. And as a Christian, again, the way I put these different pieces of this puzzle together is that there is a divine consciousness that we are kind of sharing in when we are, in the Bible it says we're made in the image of God, and I think that's something to do with that consciousness that we have, that creativity that we possess, that morality that's kind of built into us. There's something about us that says we're more than just meat machines, we're more than just DNA, that there's something spiritual, essentially, about us and about the universe. And I think more and more people are actually seeing that. I've spoken to so many people who are not necessarily Christians, but who nevertheless see that actually consciousness can't simply be explained away, that there's something really different about what it means to be human, to be conscious. And that, I think, really does open up the God question in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we're self-aware, aren't we? And even things like when you think about sort of bizarre dreams that you have, that you should be unconscious, but there's still something odd going on. You know, because some of the dreams you can have are really funny and really vivid, and you think you couldn't take the contents of that dream into a science lab, and they come back and say, oh yeah, last night you dreamt that you were being chased by a Mars bar, or can they? They can't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something about that experience that you can't just boil down into a kind of a brain scan or something like that. I mean, the brain scan might tell you that there's activity happening, but it doesn't show you what it is. You know. So I think there's all kinds of interesting ways. I mean, it's not just consciousness, though. I'd say, you know, it's fascinating when you look into the evidence for the universe itself. You know, again, Dawkins and some of his scientific colleagues have said, well, the more we know about science, the less reason we have to believe in God. I think actually the more we know about science, the more it raises the God question, because, for instance, what has modern science shown us about the universe in the past 50 or 60 years? Well, it's shown us that our best science points towards some kind of a beginning of the universe in time and space, this so-called Big Bang. Now, for all of time, space, and matter to come into existence about 14 billion years ago raises a huge question of, well, what caused that? You know, we don't normally expect things to just pop into existence from nothing, and yet the biggest thing of all, the universe, appears to have done exactly that according to our best science. So that raises a huge metaphysical question about whether there could be a cause for the universe. The universe hasn't always been here. That's what the scientists are telling us. So for me, again, that sort of points me in the direction of, well, it would need to be something, in a sense, that transcends the universe, something that transcends time, space, and matter, something that is enormously powerful, something that, frankly, has all the capacities that you would give to God. And likewise, when the universe came into being, it was birthed with these extraordinarily precise values in terms of the laws, the physical laws that govern it, the constants and so on, of things like the force of gravity and electromagnetism and all kinds of sort of, you know, the ratio of electrons to protons in the universe. So many sort of things that had to be exactly the way they are for life to develop in the universe. This is sometimes called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And again, it's another little clue that the universe seems to be crying out for an explanation beyond itself. We seem to be crying out for an explanation beyond ourselves. So I think the God question is very much on the table the more that we do the science and realise just how unlikely it is that we're here in the first place, and yet here we are to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative wouldn't it boil down to sort of one random accident followed by a series of further accidents produce all this amazing order?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it. I think it's when you actually look at what it took for us to get here, you realise just how incredibly unlikely it is that we're here if it's just random, if it's just accidents, And so for me, that's, going back to what you said about Dawkins, that quote, you said, we need a Darwin for the universe. Well, I don't know. I mean, as it stands, maybe some things aren't just going to be sort of neatly fall into a kind of, there's just some natural law that explains it all. I think in the end, the Darwin for the universe, in a way, is God. There had to be a kind of transcendent order imposed upon this story, and it's very difficult to see how you would get away from that. So I think, I can understand that Dawkins is kind of keen to sort of, I think partly, if I'm honest, and this came out in that conversation I had with him and Francis Collins, I think Dawkins just doesn't like the idea of a God who sort of creates, he would rather have a universe that just ran according to entirely naturalistic principles.
Okay.
And when he sees something that looks a bit God-shaped, it just rankles with him. He doesn't like it as a scientist. It's something that I guess he can't put in a test tube or kind of submit to scientific scrutiny. And I think that's at bottom why Dawkins doesn't like God as an explanation. He doesn't like something that kind of goes beyond science, if you like, because then it's no longer kind of within his control in that sense.
I was just wondering if it's about sort of having the need to be a clever man needing to be in control sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. So yeah, but I don't want to speak for him too much, and I really did appreciate him coming on that show.
Yeah,
but he's an interesting character, and I hope that one day he may come to change his mind. Who knows? It's never too late. But in many ways, I thank God for him as well, because he has been over the years such a source of interesting debate and conversation, for me and for the people I've interacted with.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of glad at one level that he did sort of, put these big questions in front of us and spearhead this movement. Even though, I disagree with atheism, I'm glad that he was there to ask the questions and get us thinking. And, he's provided a lot of the material, if you like, for the books that I've written. So to that extent, I think he's helped us to think through the questions, even if I disagree with him.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think that's right. One thing I'd like to ask you, Justin, in fact, it's interesting. Sometimes things sort of happen just before something else is going to happen. You say, that the timing was perfect. And something that was sort of on my mind yesterday, knowing that I was going to speak with you today. I wonder if lots of people refer to themselves as atheists because, how could we put this? Because they've experienced abuse or bullying, whatever, by those who class themselves as Christians, and they think, right, okay, if that's what a Christian is, I don't want to know, I don't want anything to do with that. Because, I don't know, going back to the whole sort of anger issue, that I think maybe there's some genuine, I think it's David Attenborough, from what I understand, he says he would love to hold faith in God, but he just personally can't see evidence for a divine creator. But he thinks it would be lovely to have faith in God. So I wonder I don't know if atheism is always about rebellion. Do you think sometimes there are some sincere, when I say sincere, in the sense that their atheism is honest, and there's others who, perhaps like Dawkins, even if they saw a glimmer for evidence for God, they'd say, no, I want to push that away.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more there. I don't think of every non-believer and atheist I meet as just someone in rebellion against God or whatever. I think absolutely there's all kinds of reasons why people don't believe. And I see a lot of people who, frankly, seem to quite want to believe, but just it hasn't quite happened for them, or whatever. And so in that sense, I'm not one of these people who says, there's no true atheist out there, they're all just really secretly in rebellion against God. I think that there are people who are kind of seeking and genuinely trying to find God. I can't speak for obviously what's going on inside everyone's heart. I have to leave that to them and to God. And my prayer is that anyone who's truly seeking would find. I mean, that's the promise that Jesus gives, And to anyone who asks, they'll receive. Anyone who knocks, the door will be opened. So my hope is that I suppose my belief as a Christian is that on that final day, when we all stand before God, no one will say I've been treated unfairly. I think there'll be a sense in which maybe some people will be surprised to find, I think there are. I think going back to your early point, a lot of people are rejecting a God who actually they're not rejecting the true God, if you like. They've been given a caricature of God. They've been perhaps given a very bad experience of God.
Yeah.
Of, some kind of toxic version of Christianity or something that they've encountered. And to that extent, I don't think, in the case of that person, that they have rejected God. They've rejected a very poor picture of God. They've rejected they don't believe in the same God that I don't believe in that sense. So I would just hope and pray that person discovers the true nature of God, the God expressed in Jesus Christ, the God who came in love and grace, and who does hold the door open to people. But in the end, I try to do my best in showing perhaps some evidence for why they would, want to believe.
Yeah.
Hopefully, live a life that shows that hopefully reflects Jesus and the grace and compassion and love of Jesus. Sadly, too many people encounter very poor versions of Christianity and very poor reflections of Jesus, and to that extent, I think I think that in the final judgment, it will be many of those people who claimed to know God and yet actually stopped people from coming to know God because of the way they didn't represent Him. That will be the ones who, as it were, God has something to say to in that final day. And my hope and prayer is that anyone who's genuinely seeking that they would encounter the God who loves them and is there. But in the end, as I say, I'm not there to judge. God is the best judge, and more than happy to leave it to Him in the final analysis.
Do you know what, Justin? Just hearing you talk and being sort of blown away by your podcast. I think if there were more Christians like you, I think the church would be more full. Well,
that's very kind, Deborah. I don't claim to have all the answers by any means.
No, but just the approach.
I do think sometimes it's about the posture we adopt, and that I think, sadly, it's just true that the Christian church has put off a lot of people by seeming arrogant or judgmental or dismissive, and that's not the Jesus I encounter. Jesus accepted people where they were. He often had challenging things to say to them. It's not a challenge, but he loved people, and there's a wonderful encounter that Jesus has where a man comes to him with their child is sick, and Jesus says, "Do you believe, that I can heal your child?" And he says, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief."
Yes.
And I think that's where a lot of us are. We're kind of a mixture of faith and doubt and belief and unbelief, but I think Jesus has compassion on people. He knows what we're like, and even if it's just the inkling of an openness, God can use that. And I just pray that I hang my head in shame when I see Christians who don't sort of embody that kind of grace and sort of expect people to sort of somehow sort themselves out and come up to their particular mark before they can enter the church. I just think that's not the way Jesus was. So that's true. I think one of I think it was the year before last. Sorry, he's just coming to mind. That Boz Tchividjian is the grandson of the late great Billy Graham, and he's the founder of Grace, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse Within the Christian Environment. I remember him saying that the best witness is to tell people you're a Christian and not be a jerk about it. And that's quite true. Great advice. But I was thinking recently about when Jesus said to Thomas, sorry, Justin, I'm sorry, I'm a minister's daughter, I should know my Bible much better than I do. I'll hang my... when Jesus said to Thomas, "Blessed are you who have seen and believed," so it's something about even more blessed are those who
have not seen yet still believe. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And I think, well, with that being said, I wonder if the Lord wouldn't be so harsh on those who don't believe and haven't seen, because it's almost like it's an expectation that, you know, it's difficult because we're not the ultimate judge at the end of the day, but it's
that's right. Yeah,
it's hard.
And I think you know, it was interesting, isn't it, that there's that saying comes when Thomas, who doubted, finally sees the risen Jesus, and Jesus says, you know, you're blessed to have seen, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And I think, you know, we're all in that position now. We weren't. We're not one of those original disciples. We haven't seen the physical risen Jesus.
Yes.
But and so, but I think Jesus sort of is compassionate towards the position we're in, where we're kind of we have. It's other things that ultimately are going to speak to us about the truth of Jesus. If we don't have the physical risen Jesus in front of us, there's going to be other things that sort of speak to that reality.
Yeah.
And I mean, in many ways, even those who knew the risen Jesus, they still doubted. They still got things wrong. It's interesting, right at the end of one of the Gospels, you know, before Jesus' ascension, it says that many were gathered, and yet some still doubted. And so doubt is just part of faith. You know, doubt is just a reality, and so we mustn't beat ourselves up because we doubt.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And faith is often about kind of trusting, really, in the midst of our doubts. You know, that's just reality. And I mean, if some Christians say, "Well, I never doubt, I never have any doubts," well, good for them. But I don't think that's the reality of most people. I think most people are this mixture of faith and doubt. But that Jesus meets us in the midst of that faith and doubt, and very often it's about kind of acting in such a way that says that's more kind of what demonstrate our faith. In fact, you know, there's a well-known story that I've told a few times of the difference between sort of faith and belief, and there was this well-known circus performer, Blondini, who used to do a lot of tightrope walking back in the 19th century, and his famous act was walking across Niagara Falls on a tightrope.
Right.
One day the King of England came to see him perform his act, and he saw Blondini walk across this tightrope, and then he saw him push a wheelbarrow across the tightrope across Niagara Falls, and then a sack of potatoes in the thing, and
that's just silly,
you know, going back and forth. And so finally Blondini came to the king and said, "Sir, do you believe that I could push a man in this wheelbarrow across Niagara Falls?" And the king said, "Yes, of course I believe that." And Blondini said, "Well, get in then." And
change your mind.
And of course that's the difference. So faith is when you actually put your trust in something, you act on something in a way. It's all very well to say I believe, but actually I think what God's more interested in is whether you trust and do something about it, and that's where the real faith comes in. So for me, I'm often more interested actually in the way people live out their faith rather than just saying I believe, I'm confident or whatever. And to that extent, I think, you know, even people who think they have very little faith can act in, you know, as though they have great faith. In fact, you know, in the way they treat people, the way they live their lives, the way they kind of act as though God is there and exists in the world, and that they have faith. So those are just a few of my rambling thoughts.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and it's all down to, you know, you should be known by your fruits, and I think, you know, that's you know, ultimately what it comes down to, isn't it? That it's you know, it's all about how you. Oh, it's really interesting stuff, and I think, it's all about showing kindness and you know, compassion, and not judging people too severely on you know, what they may not see, because some people it's very difficult, because I think we can sort of, we tend to think if it's something we personally can't relate to, then we can be harsher on, you know, that person's views, but it's all about meeting people where they're at and trying to understand them, and that's, I think it makes Christ more appealing.
And, absolutely, yeah.
But it's it's been lovely to chat with you, Justin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate what you do.
Well, thanks so much, Deborah. If anyone wants to get hold of the new book, by the way,
yes, lovely.
It's available now at my website, justinbrierley.com, and it's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and the subtitle is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And that sort of sums up the sort of the content of the book, really, why I think we're seeing this new atheist sort of movement wane, and why I think some of these interesting secular thinkers are really kind of raising the God question again in our culture. So my hope is that the church will be ready, to receive people who are maybe looking for meaning and purpose and identity again.
Yeah.
And alongside, as you said, the book, there's a new podcast as well. If they've got podcast listeners, they're very welcome to check out The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God on podcast too. But all of the links are available from my website, which is justinbrierley.com.
Oh, that's great. We'll have the those links on the homepage if that's okay.
Great, yeah. Be delighted.
And sorry, just come to, was it Anthony Flew? Much later, was he a staunch atheist, and much later in life he came to faith in Christ? Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure that he came to faith in Christ, but he certainly seemed to renounce his atheism, and that was very interesting. There was quite an interesting story around that. He was a very well-known atheist philosopher through the 1960s and 70s, but he wrote a book, or co-authored a book at least, in the sort of mid to late 2000s, called which was really about why he changed his mind. That he actually came to believe in God.
I've got it on my bookshelf. I'm looking at it as we speak, but I can't find it. Sorry, it will come to me. Yes, it was.
But, the name's just escaped me now that you mention it. But his example is very interesting because it was really scientific evidence that led him to believe actually there is a purpose behind the universe, particularly this evidence around what's sometimes called the fine-tuning of the universe for life and also biologically speaking and these kinds of things. And for him, that was enough evidence to refute his atheism, actually.
Wow.
Now, I'm not sure whether he came to believe that the God of the Bible, the Christian God, is the God behind everything. That may be something ultimately only, was between him and God in the end. But it caused quite a storm of controversy when he wrote this book, co-authored this book. People like Richard Dawkins and others claimed that, he's gone a bit senile, someone else, a kind of ghostwriter who's really making these claims on his behalf. I never had him on my show, but I did ring him up around the time when this controversy was going on. He's since passed away some time ago, but
it's a shame.
And he was very cross, actually, when I spoke to him about the fact that some of these people were saying, he's just gone a bit senile and you shouldn't, this is just a put-up job.
I bet.
He was very keen to tell me, and he told others, no, I'm not some doddery old man who's lost his mind. I'm perfectly in command of my faculties, and this is a true representation of where I am now. And he was very cross that certain people were, claiming that he was not mentally able to write such a book. So anyway, that was interesting because I got the sense that people wanted to sort of naysay the book because they didn't like the conclusions that he'd come to in the end. But yeah, he's a very interesting example. Someone where I would say there's a very good example of someone who went against the kind of materialist atheist orthodoxy and sort of got into trouble for it. He was seen as a heretic of sorts, really, because he went against that atheistic point of view.
And maybe someone like Dawkins, I think Dawkins is, going back to Dawkins, I think he commented on that something, didn't I? I think maybe he could have seen that as a bit of a threat, It's.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's always troubling, when someone who was as high profile as Anthony Flew, when he changes his mind, it goes to show, well, anyone could change their mind.
Yeah.
Even he could. He was very much the preeminent atheist philosopher of his generation, and now he was writing a book about why he'd changed his mind. So
that's interesting.
So I'm not surprised that it did create the kind of reaction it did among many of his atheistic peers, who felt, he must have lost his mental faculties or something. I think that was a better story for them to believe than he'd really come to see that there was good evidence that God existed.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's kind of like a fuel. We can put it down to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, bless you, Justin. So, thank you so much, and do keep up the good work. And I look forward to reading your book. And to the listeners, yes, buy it. It'll be great. This man's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to listening to the podcast as well, which is good stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, likewise.
And yes, all the very best to you and your listeners. And again, if anyone wants to check out the book or the podcast, justinbrierley.com.
That's lovely. Yeah, I'll be featuring those links. Wonderful stuff. Oh, yeah, thanks again, Justin. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Lots of love and God bless.